hope means to be ready at every moment for that which is not yet born, and yet not become desperate if there is no birth in our lifetime. Good evening, friends, and welcome once again to Storytime for Adults. Stories post the fourth Monday of every month. Well, it's August, hottest month of the year here in Oklahoma. So far this year, we've managed to fall into a theme with a calendar tie-in each month. Well, not this time. No, this month we're going to go back a bit, and we're going to focus on a writer that was unfortunately cut from one of our story times earlier in the year. But hopefully this means that we can give them their due. So who are we reading this month? That's an excellent question. An American poet and notorious recluse, known more for her eccentricity during her lifetime, as well as her ever-growing reluctance to meet anyone outside her household face-to-face. Emily Dickinson is by all measures one of the greatest American poets to ever put pen to paper. And yet during her lifetime, her close friends, extensive list of correspondence, and even her family were largely unaware of the sheer scope of her writing. Only 10 of her poems and a single letter were published during her lifetime, and all those under pseudonyms, while Emily Dickinson's total oeuvre numbers close to 1,800 poems. Emily Elizabeth Dickinson, was born on December 10th, 1830, to Edward Dickinson and his wife Emily Norcross. Emily was born on the family homestead in Amherst, Massachusetts, that would be the center of life for the Dickinson family for well more than a century. Though not from a rich family, per se, Emily Dickinson's family could be said to have been prominent. Her paternal grandfather, Samuel Dickinson, was one of the founders of Amherst College, and Emily's own father was a lawyer and politician who served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, the State Senate, and the United States House of Representatives, as well as serving as the treasurer for Amherst College for some 38 years. So again, while Dickinson didn't come from wealth, she did come from a family of social prominence and privilege, and was by no means poor. Emily had two siblings, her older brother William Austin and younger sister Lavinia Norcross, both of whom would outlive Emily. Emily attended a local primary school in Amherst, and then at age 10 entered the local Amherst Academy, which had recently been opened to girls. At Amherst Academy, Emily and her sister Lavinia received an impressively comprehensive and classical education for the time, especially for girls. This may have been America, but it was still the Victorian period, and women on both sides of the Atlantic were usually dissuaded from what was seen as too much education. Regardless, Emily would study at Amherst Academy until 1847 when she was 16 years old. During this time, several important things occurred that would play outsized roles for the rest of her life. First, it was at Amherst Academy that Emily Dickinson would meet many of her lifelong friends and correspondents, including Susan Huntington Gilbert, who would eventually become her sister-in-law. More on her later. Secondly, Emily, who had always felt a deep and constant menace from the prospect of death, would lose someone close to her. Her cousin Sophia Holland, who died of typhus at 14. This event seems to have had a huge effect on Dickinson, and at the time resulted in an extended stay with family in Boston in an attempt to get over the resulting depression. It may actually be this event, more than any other, that helped start the preoccupation with death that's present in much of the rest of her writing. So after leaving Amherst Academy in 1847, Emily would go on to attend Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in the nearby town of South Hadley. Though she claimed to like the girls there, she made no lasting friends while at Mount Holyoke and stayed for less than a full year. And oddly enough, we don't really know why. One theory is that there was a strong evangelical fervor at Holyoke that rubbed her the wrong way. This is unconvincing, however. Earlier in 1845, there'd been a local religious revival that had swept through Amherst, and like many others, Emily was swept up in it. The fervor wouldn't stick for her, and by 1852, she was, in her own words, observing the Sabbath by staying home. But 1847 was still early in her newfound religious faith. Other theories are that she disliked the teachers, was homesick, or had a bout of bad health. Ultimately, we don't know. However, we do know that Holyoke spelled the end of Emily Dickinson's formal education in a school setting. Excuse me. By the early 1850s, several events had happened which would begin to set a tone for Emily Dickinson's life. The headmaster of her former school, Amherst Academy, would die suddenly at 25. Her father would also introduce her to an associate of his, a young lawyer named Benjamin Franklin Newton. Newton would introduce her to some of the great English language poets like Wordsworth and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Later in her life, Emily Dickinson would refer to a few men who'd been in her life by the term "my master." The implication's widely believed to have been a reference to a schoolmaster or tutor, but her choice of words in writing was not typical for her time. And now, I mention this because there are a series of 3 letters that Dickinson wrote to an unknown person, broadly called the Master Letters. Now, I'm going to have to jump chronology a bit here and there, so bear with me, please. After Emily Dickinson's death, her younger sister Lavinia followed what were reported to be Emily's wishes and burned all of her sister's correspondence. As a result, almost all the letters that we have left are not letters sent to Emily, but letters that Emily sent to others. And of course, for the most part, we don't have the replies that were sent back to her. We have one side of the conversation. A great many of the outgoing letters of Emily's that did surface ended up eventually being heavily edited by her family, mostly her siblings. And by edited, I mean they took scissors to the original letters and physically removed words and phrases from them. It's hard to not read that level of censorship as her family attempting to either hide something scandalous or to protect Emily's reputation in some way. Now, I mentioned the 3 master letters. They were all addressed to my master, but their intended recipients never named. They are also very clearly love letters that have all been written to the same person in sequence. We also know that they were composed sometime between 1850 and 1860 or so. But really, that's it. Several individuals have been proposed, from Benjamin Newton Franklin that we mentioned above to Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a correspondent for the Atlantic that Emily would meet and correspond with extensively. We do know the intended recipient was male. That's also very clear from the letters. Some biographers have even postulated that the letters refer to God, though that seems to be a bit of a, shall we say, stretch. This probably stems from the popular image that we have of Emily Dickinson, the lifelong recluse who would often only meet new people through a closed door and could sometimes be spied from afar on her family's property only wearing white. And while all these facts are technically true, they're also pretty deeply misleading. So, since we're on the topic, I feel like we should address the other 2 major elephants in the room of Emily Dickinson's love life. Buckle up, guys. So, by the 1850s, Emily was going increasingly into seclusion, leaving the family home and property less and less often. During this decade, and for the rest of Emily Dickinson's life, Susan became one of her closest friends and the person with whom Emily wrote the most, eventually sending her over 300 letters that we know of. Now, Susan became engaged to Emily's older brother, Austin, in 1853, and they married in 1856. Though they had 3 children together, their marriage was not a happy one. Emily's letters to Susan are extensive, with Susan being Emily's most trusted advisor and editor. A great many Dickinson scholars have also concluded, based upon Emily's correspondence with her, that their relationship was a romantic one, and that Emily and Susan were lovers for a great many years. Now, for a long time after Emily Dickinson's death, the popular image was that Emily and Susan had a chilly and distant relationship. This narrative appears to have been pushed by both of her siblings, Austin and Lavinia, as well as a woman named Mabel Loomis Todd, who also happened to be Austin's longtime lover. In fact, the image of their relationship as chilly and distant was only later dispelled by Austin and Susan's own children, as well as the discovery of Emily's extensive letters to Susan through her entire life. So, if you were not familiar with Dickinson, I bet you weren't expecting that one. Well, there's one more important chapter in the love life of Emily Dickinson, and that is her late-in-life romance with an older man. In 1872 or 73, Emily met Otis Phillips Lord, an older man and judge on the Massachusetts Supreme Court. Lord's wife died in 1877, and at some point after that, their relationship appears to have become a romantic one, though again, Emily Dickinson never left her family's property or house, and seldom met anyone not in her immediate family in person. In writing, Emily said to Otis Lord, "While others go to church, I go to mine. For are you not my church? And have we not a hymn that no one knows but us?" Now, this could, of course, simply refer to their habit of always writing to each other on Sunday. Yeah, sure, okay. It's widely believed that at some point in 1883, Otis Lord proposed marriage to Emily by letter, but she either refused or simply failed to respond. Regardless, Lord ended up dying in March of 1884, not long after a pretty protracted illness. So the 1880s saw more tragedy into the life of the Dickinson family, as both Emily's mother and her favorite nephew, Austin's son Gilbert, passed away. It was during this time, 1882 to be precise, that Austin began his affair with the aforementioned Mabel Todd. Emily Dickinson started to fall ill in 1885 and eventually passed away on May 15, 1886 at the age of 55. The official cause of death at the time was said to be Bright's disease, which is a historic diagnosis for several different forms of kidney disease or nephritis. Other scholars and Dickinson historians have theorized it may have been a heart attack caused by high blood pressure. Ultimately, we don't know. But we do know that in her last years, Emily had made her younger sister Lavinia, who never married, promise to burn all of Emily's letters and correspondence. What she did not tell her sister, or anyone else for that matter apparently, was what to do with the 1,800 some odd poems that she had written and left in her room. The saga of how Dickinson's works came to be edited, published, compiled, re-edited, and so on is another tale. Suffice it to say that during her life, Emily Dickinson was utterly unknown and unrecognized by anyone as what she's turned out to be in the fullness of time, which is one of America's most unique and powerful poetic voices. Though she had only a handful of meters that she tended to write in, and often utilized odd rhyming or almost rhyming schemes and unconventional rule-breaking punctuation. And her voice as an author is singular, and it's hard to mistake for anyone else. So, well, we've been going for a bit. Why don't we read a few of Emily Dickinson's poems, shall we? Dickinson never dated any of her poems or their fragments, so scholars have had to go back and compare her handwriting to get rough dates on all of her work. So any dates that I give should be taken as strictly approximate. So let's group a few of these by subject, read a few, and then say a few words about them, shall we? So let's start with the obvious ones. Emily Dickinson had a bit of a preoccupation with death, at least in the popular image of her, and she did write about it often. It'd be wrong to think of her morbid, however, and I hope to show you that. So let's start with one of her most well-known and recognizable. Because I Could Not Stop for Death, 1863. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We drove slowly, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor, and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day, I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. So what do we really see of the image of death and dying that she gives us here? Death does not seem terrifying, like the Grim Reaper of folklore. No, he seems more like a country gentleman out for a ride, who stops to give the narrator a ride too, well, eternity. And we have a short story here as well that takes us through time and centuries in a day. But notice that unconventional rhyme, almost rhyming that I mentioned before. That's a thing for Dickinson. Next up, I heard a fly buzz when I died, 1862. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The eyes around had wrung them dry, and breaths were gathering firm for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. I willed my keepsakes, signed away what portions of me be assignable, and then it was there interposed a fly with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me. And then the window failed, and then I could not see to see. In this poem, death comes not as a friend or as a terrifying reaper, but as a fly, of all things. A narrator on their deathbed, family gathered all around them, and as they look up, a fly interposes itself, and in so doing seems to cut the cord of life. I could not see to see is a theme in Dickinson as well. She had notoriously bad eyesight later in life, and what often equated seeing with living and being and blindness with death. And did you notice something else? This is all written in the past tense. The narrator's already dead. We're hearing a poem from a corpse. Okay, so there was death. Let's go on to brighter subjects, shall we? How about psychology and emotions? Emily Dickinson was an incredible observer of emotional and mental states, and does a truly unique job of putting words to them. So first up, I felt a funeral in my brain, 1861. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I and silence, some strange race, wrecked solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. Some abrupt ending. So this one's hard to definitively interpret, and I have to admit, I really like that about this poem. It could be about the death of reason and the descent into madness. It definitely fits, it's a pretty obvious interpretation. But it could also simply be about a psychological and emotional turmoil. It could also be about the mental and emotional trauma caused by repression, feeling the need to deny or kill off a part of yourself. This poem's a classic because it works on so many levels, and of course we don't know exactly what she intended by it. Next up, it was not death, for I stood up. 1862. It was not death, for I stood up, and all the dead lie down. It was not night, for all the bells put out their tongues for noon. It was not frost, for on my flesh I felt sirocco's crawl. Not fire, for just my marble feet could keep a chancel cool. And yet it tasted like them all. The figures I've seen, set orderly for burial, reminded me of mine. As if my life were shaven and fitted to a frame, and could not breathe without a key, and 'twas like midnight sun, when everything that ticked has stopped, and space stares all around. O grisly frosts, first autumn morns, repeal the beating ground. But most like chaos, stopless, cool, without a chance or spar, or even a report of land to justify despair. There's obvious psychological torment, despair even, last word of the poem, but notice how she starts out by telling you what it isn't. Like before moving into more affirmative similes in the second half of the poem. This is almost a negative theology of pain. Again, Dickinson's ability to show a mind or emotion in torment is really awe-inspiring. So let's see one more on emotions and emotional states, shall we? After a great pain, a formal feeling comes. After a great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore? And yesterday or centuries before? The feet mechanical go round, wooden weary of ground or air or aught, regardless ground, a quartz contentment like a stone. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow, first chill, then stupor, then the letting go. So this one's really interesting to me, because she's not talking so much about the emotion, but what comes in its wake. The physical feeling that a sort of psychological numbness that comes after strong emotion. Notice how she equates those physical sensations that we're all so familiar with to physical things as a way to describe a quality that those things all have in common with the feeling we have. Again, this is classic Dickinson. All right, let's shift a little bit and go into our last several poems. I picked each of these because they're either startling and unique in their own right, or because they show us something that Dickinson has become pretty well known for. Hope is the thing with feathers. 1861. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could have bashed the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. This poem's really interesting. It's upbeat, life-affirming. Certainly a counterpoint to her poems about death, madness, and emotional turmoil. And yet, there's something that you all didn't get from this poem because you're hearing it and not reading it. Hope is in quotation marks. Hope. What did she mean by that? I mean, I don't think air quotes were a thing at her time, but the quotation mark has always meant what it meant. How does that change our understanding of the hope that she's talking about? Along with her first poem of the evening, this one is also one of Emily Dickinson's best known, and most people read it straight. A bird came down the walk. A bird came down the walk. He did not know I saw. He bit an angleworm in halves and ate the fellow raw. And then he drank a dew from a convenient grass, and then hopped sideways to the wall to let a beetle pass. He glanced with rapid eyes that hurried all abroad. They looked like frightened beads, I thought. He stirred his velvet head. Like one in danger, cautious, I offered him a crumb, and he unrolled his feathers and rode them softer home. Then oars divide the ocean to silver for a seam, or butterflies off banks of noon leap splashless as they swim. So this poem is interesting. I'm not sure when it was written, but I know that it was published posthumously in 1891. In this poem, we see Dickinson as the keen, highly detailed observer that we've seen in her other poems. But here, instead of it being turned inward, it's turned outward. She describes the scene as if she's come upon a casual murder, and then the unexpected sense of danger, where she seems to offer the bird a crumb as a sort of bribe. And of course, her use of similes, especially in the end, is definitely on point. All right, so these next two I'm going to read back to back. I should note here, and I probably should have said earlier, Emily Dickinson did not usually title her poems, and so oftentimes their title is simply the first line of the poem. That's definitely the case with everything we've read tonight and the others that follow. This is my letter to the world, 1862. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me, the simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. Next, tell all the truth, but tell it slant, 1868. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Both of these poems to me seem to be artistic or poetic manifestos of a sort. Right? The first, her letter to the world, asks to be judged tenderly. It's almost ironic, given the titanic influence and attention that her art would come to have. And in her second, she says to tell the truth, but with a slant. She isn't really endorsing putting spin on things here. She tells us in the last two lines, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. She's telling us we cannot see or grasp the whole truth of things if we are shown it all at once or shown it straight. Rather, it takes time, and perhaps the poet's slant to truly enlighten us. Given her masterful use of metaphor and simile, this is not a surprising idea for her to have, but it's also one I don't think she gives us cynically. No, there's a sort of wonder in what she's expressing here. All right, so one more poem. Just one. I don't know if I saved the best for last, but among the ones that we are reading tonight, it's definitely a unique one. This one is a love poem, and not just a staid, chaste love poem, but one with real passion and all the poetic tools that we've seen her deploy so far. Wild Nights, 1861. Wild nights, where I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury. Futile the winds to a heart in port, done with the compass, done with the chart. Flowing in Eden, all the sea, might I be more tonight in thee. 12 short lines. She sure does use them. Not exactly the image of a shy-closeted Victorian flower, is it? Again, that's just not love, but passion. It's always hard to have any idea where we should separate Emily Dickinson from her poems. What was autobiographical and what was just a flight of fancy? We can't really know, but I'm inclined to believe that this one was about someone real and specific. And we see an expert use of a nautical metaphor strung through the whole poem. I'm sure this one surprised the first people to read it, who had only the vision of Emily as a reclusive, shy woman in white. So, I'm going to call that it for this evening. I hope you all have enjoyed our story time. I hope I've inspired you to perhaps pick up and read a little more Emily Dickinson, who was probably the social distancing champion of 19th century New England. And I wish you all a wonderful evening.